non-creativity leader of the opposition. Now we move on to the closing half of the debate. We welcome first member of the government from BDU. Speak a bit louder.
Can you hear me like that? Okay, great. So Madam Speaker, what I'm going to do for you today in my speech is I'm going to deal a little bit with what we heard from first opposition, and then I have a lot of clarification and a lot of explanation of how the debate actually works and how we need this plan to be implemented and how we can deal with all the harms that they come up with. A little bit to my structure later on in my speech. But now, what we heard here. He says we already have the certainty of the numbers. But you know, we say we don't, because there are a lot of acknowledged scientists that say we don't really know if it is man-made. It might also be just a normal, cycle that happens every 1,000 years, and we're just right now in one of at this point. So the debate, even on the scientific field, is not clear. But we have harms from that unclarity for certain societies, for everybody on the ground, for everybody on the planet. That's why we believe we have to be politically active and simply not care that much about scientific integrity in this place here. Second of all, he says the battle we fight is whether people listen to that or not. If that is his point, we say, well then, you should be on our side, because with our plan we have more evidence and this will make more people listen to us, so we actually have a mechanism for something that you also care about. Then he says, at the very end, he has this problem that, we're going to harm science. First of all, we very clearly say, even if we harm science, we don't care that much, because we can weigh that up and say, on the other side, we kind of save the world, we kind of make the world a better place for all of you, for all of us, for people in the Philippines that don't have clear air to breathe, so that they have nicer air here to live in a better place. And we also say that, the harm on science won't last like forever. It might be a little bit of a time. We believe science will recover, it will get its integrity back, but in that time, we will have a much better place to live in, and we believe that is much more important. That is what politics should care about, and not scientific integrity. Not very much, no, thank you very much. So, one thing I would like to address first in my speech is, how do people make decisions? Because the burdens that they try to put on our side is simply unrealistic. They say we need 100% certainty until we can act upon something. No, that is not true. That is not how decisions are made in real life, nowhere. Because what you do when you make a decision is, you have a certain amount of facts. For instance, oftentimes it is enough for you to have 70% of, probability that is going to happen. That's when you act or not act. For instance, when we try to make people stop smoking, we don't really have 100% proof of that smoking causes breast cancer or whatever kind of lung cancer or whatever cancer, but still the government acts upon that because we have a lot of research telling us that the likelihood of you getting cancer when you smoke a lot is very high. That's why we act upon that. We don't have 100%, we still can act upon that. We believe it's very unrealistic and it's not fair to put a burden in this specific case on us that doesn't exist in any other case. Thank you very much. The second point I would like to talk about goes deeper into that when we talk about the unbalance of burden of proof in this debate when it comes to the environment. Because the people that don't believe that it is man-made are shifting the burden and asking us for absolute certainty. But we say, we cannot have 100% certainty in this case, but we say we have other good reasons why we should want to make people believe that it's their fault when it gets warmer, that it's their fault when the air gets less clean, because we want people to change their behavior, to vote for parties that actually change the environmental politics, have cleaner cars and so on and so forth. We have good reasons, and that is exactly the answer to closing opposition's questions. Why do you need to exaggerate the fact that it is man-made? Because the debate is skewed. Because that is why we need to exaggerate the fact that it's man-made. And now I'd like to also tell you that what we're doing here is that we're doing something that is the right thing, and we're doing it for the right reasons. Even if we might be lying, we don't care about that, because those two things are on our side in this debate. Are we doing the right thing? Yes, because we're trying to make the world a cleaner place. We're trying to save woods. We're trying to make rivers more cleaner so that people have a nice environment to live in, so that people don't get sick only because their air is so bad, only because, you know, we don't simply stop being so luxurious and, you know, have a little bit more uncomfortable lives, pay a little bit more so that we have a better environment and preserve that environment. And we believe we're doing that exactly for the right reasons, exactly for this, what I have just said in my speech here. Yes, closing quick.
Okay, do you think it matters for the kinds of measures you need to take, whether it is man-made or whether it is caused by something else?
Yes, we believe that, because it depends on, you know, what the people accept from you doing. Because if people believe it is actually their fault, that they can do something about the climate, that they can actually change something with their everyday behavior, they're more likely to vote for parties that will implement measures that might make their lives a little less easy, but they will understand that it is okay to do that because it is, you know, it is their fault that things are happening and they can change something about that. Lastly, what I would like to talk about is this idea of lying and can we do something and this harm to science. Because we already say the harm to science has already happened. Because what is expected here to happen is that we expect science to prove. Yes, okay. We already have this politicization of science, as I explained at the beginning of my speech, and we say we have to act on the same grounds. Because people are kidnapping scientific research for political reasons and saying, you know, we don't really know whether it's man-made. We have certain studies here, and that's why we should definitely not act upon that. Continue our lifestyle, as is, for instance, the debate in the United States. And we say we have to go into this field as well and take science on the other side and say, you know, we have to exaggerate the data. We have to make people believe that it is man-made, so that we have some kind of equality in this debate. And we also would like to say that, you know, in the end, even if it is lying, we say if the outcome is a good thing, and we all believe that the outcome will be a good thing, because we will have a cleaner environment, we will all have healthier lives, we will all enjoy ourselves much better if we live in a better environment that is not, I don't know, grey and ugly, but green and blue and nice. We believe that those are good reasons to do something. And we believe that that also justifies harming science for a certain period of time when we can actually make the world a much, much better place for all of us, because science in and of itself isn't just there to be science, but it is also there to benefit all of us. And that's why we believe in the short term we will have better conditions for all of us, the world will be a much, much better place, and in the long term we also have a moral obligation to make this world a better place, to keep it at least as good as it is right now, or even make it better for future generations, because they also want to enjoy to see a wood, they also want to enjoy to see, I don't know, blue sky, and not as oftentimes we have seen here in the Philippines, grey sky all day long, although, you know, it's because of the smog. So that's why we say we have a lot of reasons why we need to step into this debate that is already skewed on the political side, that science is already abused. That's why we need to do that. We have the right reasons, we're doing it for the right reasons, and we will have the right outcomes, and that's why we believe we can balance that and have you do that policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Member of the Government. We welcome the Member of the Opposition from Leiden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the basic assumption that we got from the other side is that people and governments are myopic, that they are not able to make sure that they weigh the benefits of and disadvantages of climate change. Now, in our extension, we will prove that even if that assumption is right, that this policy is immoral and that it has lots of bad consequences for countries and people. But first, let's go into some rebuttal. We heard from the opening government that there is an emotional gap. People aren't able to value the consequences of environmental change. Now we say that emotional gap can be closed without lying. If you make documentaries about the consequences when your country will drown, people will be able to be closely attached to the consequences that will be there in the future, so you can close the emotional gap. The one difference, however, is when you start actively lying to people about when the danger will come, because that alters their behavior in a bad way. Now, secondly, why do we need to emphasize that this global warming is man-made? We posed that question, but we didn't get a satisfying answer. We think that that is relevant for this debate, because firstly, if you exaggerate the extent to which global warming is man-made, that tends to influence the measures that you want to take. So you will focus on the economy instead of, for instance, restoring the trees and all other measures that you want to take. Or governments will invest research in a very myopic way, whereas they would be able to invest research in other ways. So it influences the behavior of governments. Thirdly, what we'd like to point out is that facts aren't neutral. They have political implications. So when you assert that global warming is man-made, the consequences will be twofold. We say, firstly, the burden of reducing carbon dioxide in the air will be on companies rather than on the entirety of society. Secondly, we think it is very important for global justice. For instance, who has to pay for instance, who has to pay for the amount of pollution that currently exists? If it's man-made, then the countries who have big economies have a guilt in the pollution that currently exists. So we think that's problematic. Now, what we heard from the closing government is that people necessarily need to know that it's their own fault, because if it's not their own fault, they will not care about the fact that their country will be drowned in a few years. We don't think that that is true. We think if people know the consequences, they already know enough that they need to take measures. They don't necessarily need to realize that it's their own fault, especially when it's a lie. Now sit down. Now, let's go into my extension. Our first point is that it's immoral to inflict fear upon people when it's not justified. We say, firstly, it influences the behavior of these people without without there being a factual basis to that restriction. We think an analogy can be drawn with, for instance, terrorism. We think we constantly underestimate the danger in which we are because of terrorism. That doesn't mean that governments have a right to say, well, the danger of terrorism is instant. It can happen every second, and you must be fearful of what might happen. We think that the infliction of fear on people without it having a factual basis, we think that's something which is wrong or which you shouldn't do as a scientist nor as anybody. Opening.
The environment is unique. You can't save the environment in one day. It takes a very long time. Why will I be environmental friendly when I know the effect which I will get is 20 or 50 years down the road?
Okay, because we do that in multiple occasions, because we want future generations to, for instance, benefit of the country. We don't want our children and our grandchildren to die. That might be a good incentive for you to make sure that it happens. We think these incentives are already there in the democratic process. And this is my second point. We think that we in the democratic process always make, or as governments, always strike a balance between the short-term and long-term consequences of policy. Because ultimately, we don't care about the now, but we also care about the future. Because that's where our children, our grandchildren, our grandchildren will live. We think that these people also have a right. So that is something which we already conclude in the democratic process and which governments already do. For instance, by making fishing quotas, because we don't want the seas to be empty in a few years or in the future, and as a consequence of which people would be hungry or wouldn't have food anymore. So that balance has already been made. And we think Tel Aviv made a good point when it pointed that out. But what is important is that the consequences of global warming aren't spread equally around all of the countries. So we think some countries have more disadvantages because of that global warming. We think, for instance, countries who live at a low sea level have an incentive to, for instance, make dikes. And for instance, the exaggeration to the extent to which global warming is man-made will selectively influence the behavior of these countries, whereas countries who aren't as much in danger will not be as much incentivized and as much deterred by the exaggeration. So we think that you are making an imbalance between countries who fear global warming more and countries who don't have to fear global warming more. We think the Netherlands and the people of the Netherlands, of Bangladesh, would be a lot more fearsome of global warming, which would make sure that their economies would adjust to that because they are more fearsome of that than the United States. Now let's go to the third point that I want to make. No, thank you. We think that countries, for instance, that pollution is also a prisoner's dilemma. We think that in a global society, you have to make sure that there is an international agreement on how to deal with pollution. We think there is a discrepancy between the benefits countries have. For instance, the United States has a lot of benefits because of the pollution that it causes because of its economic activity. We think already we see that the United States doesn't have enough incentives to make that. Once you exaggerate these consequences, it will be exaggerated to the extent that the measures that are needed seem to be very dire and very disproportionate. Now, we think that would limit these kind of countries from opting into a system in which they would make sure that pollution would exist less. Now, why is that problematic? Because we think in the status quo, we see that countries with high economic productivity have some incentive because it's a gradual change, because they don't see that it infringes as much on their economic situation. But when you make sure that the consequences seem so dire and that we need to take such drastic measures, these countries would be less incentivized. That would prevent gradual regulation and gradual development of these of laws which make sure that regulation that the pollution ceases to exist. For all these reasons, we stand very proud in our position.
Thank you very much, member of the opposition. Now we welcome the government whip from BDU.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to answer, in my whip speech, I'd like to answer two questions again. The first question is, why do you have to exaggerate the certainty of global warming? And the second is, how do you deal with the consequence that you may or may not be harming science, taking into consideration that science has been harmed before? But first, I would like to say some rebuttal. We got a couple of things from closing opposition. The first was in a speech as well as in the POI, and it was the question, do you believe it matters whether global warming is man-made or not, according to the measures you're going to take? Yes, we do. If global warming is in fact man-made, then we're going to start introducing measures that target that kind of climate change. And we're targeting typically here things such as pollution, etc. So yes, of course, we think it matters. We also think it matters on a global level because we believe that it institutes into people and companies the idea that to a certain extent we are responsible for our planet, that we have caused the damage to it, and that we need to fix this problem up. And we don't want these people to continue being in this bubble where they simply believe, oh, it's just our fate, it's just nature, it's going to happen sooner or later, there's nothing we can really do about it. We also buy the second point of the prisoner's dilemma, that we all kind of need to act together. What we don't buy, that's a necessary excuse for every single country to ignore the fact that climate change actually exists. We don't think that's a reason why there should be massive political capital for the fact that climate change doesn't really exist. If you want people to prioritize and be all rational and weigh up this against saving starving kids or sort of increasing the quality of life in their country, we believe you can do that. But we believe it is wrong for people to be able to deny the fact that climate change exists in general, and for that's not to come into debate, etc. Secondly, we ask, is it immoral for us to inflict fear in our citizens? We think we inflict fear in our citizens all the time. The degree to which we do this simply depends on the degree to which our citizens are rational or not. We believe human beings aren't generally very rational, that citizens will sort of try their chances at gambling, will sort of go through all sorts of security measures if they think there's a security threat. Another very relevant example is that on a lot of cigarette packs, it says smoking kills. There is no 100% of certainty that every person that smokes that cigarette is going to kill. It might scare a couple of people, but we don't really think that's harmful. We certainly don't think it's immoral. So now to my first point. Why do we have to exaggerate uncertainty?
We have 3 reasons. We think A, because combating climate change is vitally important. We think B, because we need more rational politics. And we think C, because we need to come back into this political game that has been so skewed by people that don't believe in climate change simply because they don't want to believe in climate change. So why do we think it's so important? We think the long-term effect, the long-term reasons are obvious from all sorts of videos we've seen of ice beds drowning, etc. That we are ruining our planet, that we don't really think we have the moral right to do that we kind of care about future generations, and that we have this kind of sense of karma that makes us believe that we don't really need to pollute and ruin more than we should. We also think, secondly and most importantly, is the short-term effects. There's a question a good friend of mine once asked me, and he said, what if we clean up all the rivers? What if we open up all the skies? What if there are fishes in the sea, and then it should turn out that climate change was a lie? Well, then suddenly we're living in a wonderfully beautiful planet, and we're giving people the quality of life they deserve all over the world. We believe we win on this sort of even if case, even though Desi and I certainly believe that climate change is very real. Secondly, because it's simply rational to act. I've said before that people don't often act very irrationally, that you might try your chances of gambling even though there's only a 2% chance that you might win $1 million. We think governments don't have this kind of luxury. We think even if there was only a 60 or 70% chance that climate change is killing our people now, decreasing their quality of life, and ruining the politics, we think people should take this into consideration as sort of a very real threat. We think the only reason people aren't acting rationally in the field of climate change is because it's been over-politicized. And I'd like to talk about this political process in a second. Before that, I'll take over.
If things like failed prediction undermine the reliability of science, then people will listen to activists less. How will you save the world then?
Well, we assume oftentimes this won't come out. And secondly, I'm going to talk about that in a way we're not really talking about real scientists. In a way, the people we're going up against don't really care about science in the first place. Why is that? We say that when we talk about global warming in a lots of states, there are people that don't, sometimes they tend to be slightly conservative, they don't believe in global warming because they don't want to believe in global warming. We then ask them, why don't you believe in global warming? And they don't give us any reasons. They then say, oh, we have these statistics and these tests and these experiments that prove it's all a lie, it's all a conspiracy, it's all completely unlikely. They then say to us, we're only going to believe in global warming, we're only going to talk to you, we're only going to debate with you, we're only going to take any measures if you give us more certainty, if you give us that 90% or more of the 90%. We believe we can now do one of two things. Either we give up the debate and say, sorry, we don't have these 90%, and we cannot prove your tests because they're not real tests and not falsifiable in the first place, or we can give them to them. We think under the circumstances that we're improving the quality of life and saving the planet, this is morally correct. We see that it harms science, but we don't really think it's science in the first place. Open in government says, how can you allow opinions to change your perception of truth and science? We say it's because opinions are that which changes our perception of anything, and we don't really know what truth is. We believe the debate that's being held on climate change is not being held in sort of laboratories and only between scientists. It's very much a societal, political debate that needs to be had. And that's why we think we can abuse science in these cases. It might be a slightly lame excuse that we're sort of abusing science because everybody has done it in the right place first, done it as well before we did. But we think in the end we still win because we're doing it for the right reasons. And currently we see no other way to save the planet and act rationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Government Whip. Now we welcome the last speaker for this grand final. Opposition Whip, please.
Thank you for the floor, and thank you for the opportunity to stand here and speak. So I'm going to summarize this debate on basically three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about can you exaggerate and what are the dilemmas in that. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the effects on countries, what kind of things will they be likely to do, and on the democratic process. And lastly, we're going to talk about global change. Why does it matter who is responsible and what kind of institutions are responsible for climate change in tackling it in a correct way, and why we think that's very important. All my rebuttal will be integrated except for one thing. Because we heard this idea that you cannot see the environment, right? And therefore it is bad, or you're not able to make decisions about how it will be in 50 years, or you don't care about that. First of all, we already heard the response that you have granted. But we think that the line that they've chosen is more problematic for other reasons, right? We think that, but if we would accept that people only think about themselves in the here and now, that will mean you need to exaggerate to the extent that it will affect them dramatically in their own lifetime. That means that the actions they will be taking will be only damage control and not preventing it for future generations. We think that is massively important, especially given that they have claimed on the entire prop line that it takes much longer to restore the environment than it does to hurt the environment. Given that their assumption is that people only think about themselves in the here and now, they will never go for lowering the expulsion, they will just go for preparation things. We think that's massively problematic for their burden of proof. And moving on to my first clash, can you exaggerate? What we basically heard is, yes, you can exaggerate because now there are evil companies like ExxonMobil, whatever, oil, something, who suppress the outcomes of studies about this. First of all, we say if that's the problem, then stop this lobbying, right? Because the problem you're giving us is saying there's faulty information. But moreover, we think you are making this worse on two grounds. First of all, we think you're spreading lies yourself, which is bad. But moreover, we think you create a pressure for these companies to suppress the outcome of these things even more, right? Secondly, we think that the disparity between what companies researchers say and what the government researchers say will become much bigger, therefore create much more confusion and much less social consensus about what should be done. We think that is problematic. The second reason why we heard that you should why you can exaggerate is the reason that there's an emotional gap between what will happen and how people feel about this. We think this is specifically something you can tackle by making it personal, by having movies about the humanity of the victims, not by creating more charts or making the charts a little bigger or the graphics a little, or the graphs a bit higher, right? But we think you don't tackle it in that way. But moreover, then they said, no, but you should make it a priority, and that's why we can exaggerate. We think, first of all, that they have not sufficiently proven to us why it deserves to be a priority, right? But at the point where they say you should err on the side of caution, we think that they are not doing that. We think you can spend money wise. If you are a country and you think your people are either going to die of AIDS or maybe because there will be more deforestation and more deserts in your country and they might starve of hunger, if you have to decide between which of the two is more likely or causes more death, you make that decision. You can spend that money once on what you're going to do. Given that you overemphasize one of which you're not sure it is true, it is likely that you make the wrong decision and that people will die, whereas if you had the good information, you might have made a better decision that saves more lives. And we think this disproportionately targets poor countries and the countries that are affected by climate change. We think that is bad. And lastly, we think it creates less trust in what comes out, right? We think that if 10 years later it points out that it wasn't true, what you claimed would happen in 10 years, people won't trust these things. We think it's sort of the boy who cried wolf thing. People will not trust you anymore, even when you were right, and we think the effects of that will be more detrimental, as Ali has explained to you. Now, on this point about effects, right, because we think, yes, global warming is bad, but the idea is how to go about it. And we heard several things. You could have less exhaustion, like, for instance, limiting factories and stuff like that, or you could do things like preparation, having dams, or changing crops. But we're saying the rate on which things are changing matters massively for what decision you are going to make and what countries are going to do these things. We think that if voters are going to vote different, we think that first of all in affected countries by climate change, like Bangladesh or the Netherlands, or countries where the climate will change for crops and stuff like that, will invest much more in preparations. But we think also the focus will be on cracking down on big companies who do pollution. We're saying, first of all, they might, if it's not man-made, that might not affect the outcome of this. But second of all, we think they'll have less money, which enables governments, gives them less opportunity to create changes that might be necessary. But moreover, we think it creates an imbalance in fear. We think that you create a specific idea of fear, it's comparable with terrorism, right? Where you overemphasize this all the time. We think that the harm you create from that, the restricted versions of their lives, the less money you have, the ability of which you're in fear of those things, we think that is ultimately a much bigger harm. But even if it was not, we think it is up for a democratic process to decide which of those is more important. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
What if you are certain, and you are to a certain degree fearful, you just don't have the political capital to convince the opposition?
Yes, madam, but even if you are certain that there are effects to some extent, that doesn't justify saying that it's came by the causes of humans. But I'm going into that more. So we're saying that the political process always has opportunity costs, and you have to weigh those up. We think you weigh up the way in which you make decisions. Is the quality of life of your current generation as opposed to the long-term and future generations. We think that you distort, first of all, this process, which creates not a good outcome for both of these groups. Moreover, we think you create an imbalance in which countries are at fault and which countries are affected, and how they have to spend this. We think this creates a global injustice about who is responsible for this. Now, lastly on this point about global change, right? Because what we're saying is, now there is gradual change. We see that there are countries that are opting into changing less. We say, however, if you make the effects much bigger and you create much more pressure, they will be saying we will not bind ourselves to these contracts or bind ourselves to the Kyoto Protocol with consequences because we might not be able to make this. Or we might not sacrifice our profits, especially not if it's, for instance, America, which will probably not be affected by global change that much as other countries, right? So we think that overall the effectiveness becomes less. But moreover, we think that, and that they won't opt into these treaties. That's why we think that having something that allows all countries to opt in is much better, and you need a gradual idea of how this is progressing. But moreover, on the point of man-made, which is very important in this debate, what the debate is actually about, saying if it is not man-made, the changes you make through limiting the human element of this is actually not something that will limit the amount of climate change, right? It will still be bad. We think that is very problematic, given also the analysis about not giving in. We think the action should be taken is ways to transform CO2, to have more trees, ways to store it. And we think that there should be a burden on all countries to do this, and not just by claiming the idea that you can all solve it by having less explosion by companies, whereas it might not all be true that that's the reason, or that will be an ability to make less pollution in the world, right? So we say that's why you need to make sure who is responsible for this. If it is not humans, humans cannot change it that much by limiting factories and stuff. We need to take other measures. For these specific reasons, opposition wins this debate.